You know, I was thinking today, and sometimes thinking's a dangerous thing for me to do, but I was thinking today that there are parts of the Word of God that we find it difficult to understand. We'll read a verse and have no idea what the verse means. How can we take the words that are in that verse and put it in a way that we can understand? Why is it that we have trouble understanding a lot of the language that's there in the King James Bible?
It's not the language you use today.
Yeah, it is. It is. Did any of you have to study any of Shakespeare's writings in school? That was hard for me, because Shakespeare didn't talk the way we talk today. To be or not to be. What does that mean? Shall I kill myself or shall I live? That's what he was. A lot of the things that are in Shakespeare's writings were things that would be common back when he wrote them in the 1500s. But to you and I today, it's different. Now, Shakespeare wrote around 1560, and that is when the Geneva Bible was popular. Shakespeare would have read and quoted from the Geneva Bible. The Bible that we normally use, I've used all my life, is the King James, and it was translated and written when? 1611. So that was just after Shakespeare. But the language hadn't changed. The language in the Bible is the same language that Shakespeare would have spoken. But it's not the English that we use today. And for that reason, a lot of times we have difficulty understanding exactly what is meant in a verse. Well, I just wanted to throw that out there. As we've seen in our past two lessons, the Apostle Paul has been accused of not being a fantastic orator, speaker. That didn't bother me. Shouldn't bother any preacher if somebody says, you're not much of a speaker. What should bother the preacher is if somebody says you're not teaching the truth. That's what should bother a preacher. Whenever Paul, however, was accused by some in Corinth of not being an apostle, then he vehemently defends that position. And that position had been given to him from above. He was an apostle. Now, in Corinth, there were false apostles. And they were doing nothing more than using the members of the church in the city of Corinth. And they were using the members for their own gain. Undoubtedly taking money for their teaching, whereas Paul had never financially gained anything while preaching for the church at Corinth. Well, last week we began to see Paul starting to defend himself in order to prove that he was indeed sent by the Lord himself to further the work started by the Master on this earth. And that's what the apostles were told to do. Jesus had gone teaching and preaching throughout Palestine, and whenever he was ready to leave, he told his apostles, go into all the world. Preach the gospel. Do what I started. You continue doing what I started. We know that a tree is known by its fruits. Paul now is going to begin speaking as to the ways that he had suffered for the cause of Christ. And the reason that he begins to tell what he had suffered, what he had gone through for the cause of Christ, in effect is daring any of these false apostles in Corinth to even begin to compare with the adversity that he had encountered and endured. By doing this, he's trying to even get the Christians at Corinth to see the truth of the matter. These people are taking you, they're not real apostles. I, on the other hand, was telling you the truth. And I am an apostle. As we look into tonight's lesson, we're going to see Paul mentioning things that happened to him. Now, some of the things that he's going to say happened to him, you're not going to be able to find in the Bible. Or he was looking into the future and seeing what would happen to him. Why do I say this? The 2 Corinthian letter was written when, Jeff? Jeff's usually our master date knower. 2 Corinthians was written around the year 56 AD. Paul is going to be shipwrecked, and he's going to talk about being shipwrecked. Paul is going to be shipwrecked, but that's not going to happen until around the year 61 AD, 5 years after he writes this 2 Corinthian letter. Whenever Paul talks about things that we cannot put our finger on in the Bible, in the book of Acts, where it talks so much about the life of Paul, we have to come to the conclusion that not everything Paul did and not everything that happened to him is recorded. I mean, let's face it, how many years was he a missionary preaching? Well, that would take a volume this big to put everything in there about every sermon he preached and everything that he did and everything that happened to him. Much like the life of Jesus. Not everything he did is recorded, but what we need has been recorded. In this letter and in our study tonight, he's going to talk about being shipwrecked. Nowhere else except when he was shipwrecked on the island of Melita is mentioned about him being shipwrecked. But as I said, that happened 5 years after he writes this letter. Well, there's a possibility that Paul had been shipwrecked before that disaster at Melita, or Paul, by inspiration, knows what the future holds for him. Let's go ahead, begin our study tonight. The final study from 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I accidentally put chapter 12 on Facebook today, but it's chapter 11. Tonight we begin at verse 21. Paul says, I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Paul, what do you mean by this? What does this statement mean? Paul says, to my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison. Or he's saying, you people at Corinth have permitted me to be shamed by ignoring the humility and servitude with which I had come to you. Paul says, I speak foolishly. He hated having to defend himself. There was no need for this man to have to defend himself. He'd defend the gospel, he would defend Jesus, but he hated to have to defend himself. And he's going to defend himself by, in effect, bragging about what he had suffered for the cause of the Lord. Paul says to the Corinthians, these false apostles who you're listening to, they claim to be bold. I'll tell you what, they can't hold a candle to the boldness that I am going to be bringing out. They don't have anything over me. He says in verse 22, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. These are words we've heard for years. Hebrews, Israelites, descendants of Abraham. Well, is there any difference in them? Let me throw another one out at you. Is there any difference between a Hebrew and an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and a Jew? Is there?
God's chosen people in the Old Testament.
Yeah. They're all the same, aren't they? Describing a group of people. Well, a Hebrew is anybody of the Jewish or Israelitish nations. The word Israelite is somebody who is of the nation of Israel, any descendant of Israel. Listen, what person got his name changed to Israel?
Jacob.
Jacob did. And so any descendant of Jacob is an Israelite. Now, was Jacob one of the 12?
No.
Oh! So we've got Abraham started it, his son Isaac, and Jacob. So Jacob was the daddy of the 12 tribes of Israel. Yeah. And Jacob was the one who got his name changed from Jacob to Israel by God Himself. Now the word Jew, it is true that before Israel was carried into Babylonian captivity in the year 606 BC, a Jew was one who lived in Judea. But after 606 BC, from then on, 400-year period, right on through the book of Malachi, the word Jew means anybody who was a Hebrew, a descendant of Abraham, and Israelite. So there's no difference in the world between a Hebrew and an Israelite and a Jew and a descendant of Abraham. They're all different words, phrases used to describe the same people. In fact, we have an example. What book would we go to look up Mordecai? You remember Mordecai?
Esther.
Esther. The book of Esther talks about a man by the name of Mordecai. Mordecai was of the tribe of Benjamin. Tribe of Benjamin. And that in Esther 2 and verse 5, he's referred to as that Jew, Mordecai. So, Jew, Hebrew, Israelite, descendant of Abraham, they're all the same. Well, in this verse, Paul's merely bringing out his pedigree. He's saying, these people claim to be Jews. I'm a Jew too. I'm a Hebrew too. I'm an Israelite too. I'm a descendant of Abraham too. In fact, in Philippians 3:5, he's going to call himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews. No one could doubt his ancestry. Now, the verse starts out, are they Hebrews? Are they, who's the they? These false apostles over there in Corinth who are causing trouble. Paul says they claim to be this. I'm too. They're no better than I am whenever you talk about pedigree. I am as much of a Jew, as much of a Hebrew, as much of an Israelite as any of these people. Verse 23. Paul says, are they, these false apostles over in Corinth causing trouble, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Paul had already answered that first question that he puts up there. Are they ministers of Christ, he says. You remember last week? Paul had some words that he called these false apostles over in Corinth. In 2 Corinthians 11:13, Paul had called those men false apostles and deceitful workers. And then he says, they transformed themselves into apostles of Christ. Paul says, I speak as a fool. I had to look up that word fool. That's the Greek word paraphroneo. It means to be beside oneself or to be insane. Paul says, I'm going to brag about myself like a crazy man. I have labored for the Lord more than all of those false apostles. I have been beaten excessively. Now, under Jewish law, according to Deuteronomy 25:3, if Dad takes me to court before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin says, I'm guilty, I deserve to be punished. How many times could I be beaten as a means of punishment?
39.
40. I could be beaten 40. But, yeah, you've heard the story, and it's true, that there would be a person counting. The beating was done by a whip that had three lashes on it. And they would hit you in the middle of the back. There was one person beating, another person doing the counting. To make sure that that person doing the counting didn't miss one, they'd have him stop at 39. Didn't want to break the law. Didn't mind beating that poor fella, but they didn't want to break the law. All right. Now, that was the Jewish law. What was the Gentile law? Beating till you're done. Beating till you feel like he's been punished enough. All right. The Gentiles didn't have that maximum number of 40 or 39 in their law. The Apostle Paul and Silas, when they went to Philippi, remember they were arrested in Philippi? They're going to end up in jail. And at midnight they were singing and praying. Before they were taken to the jail, what was done to them? They were beaten. They were beaten. Had Paul been beaten? Yeah, Paul had been beaten. He knew what it was like. Now, was Philippi a Jewish city? No, it's clear over in Europe. It was a Gentile city. The city of Philippi was in Macedonia, which today is a part of Europe. It wasn't a Jewish city. There wasn't that 39 and we'll stop. It was beating till you're done. So we don't know how bad the beating was. It could be, too, that the beating there was not done by the lash, but rather was done by what's called the rod. All right. Paul was not only beaten by Jews, he was also beaten by Gentiles. Paul says, I was in prisons more frequent. The Bible tells us about one time in Philippi. Also tells us about him being arrested in Jerusalem, taken to Caesarea, imprisoned there. We know that he would have been imprisoned in the city of Rome. But how many other times was Paul put in prison? Don't know. Those are the only ones the Bible tells us about. What about those false apostles? You reckon any of them were ever in prison? No. Paul says, I was in death's oft. It seems many times Paul was in danger of death from the very first time that he had become a child of God in the city of Damascus. What did he have to have done for him?
He had to be led.
Yeah, they were going to, and the very last verse of this chapter is going to tell us, they were after him. They were after him to get rid of Paul. Paul had to be let down in a basket from the city wall in order to escape being beaten or put to death in the city of Damascus. And that was very early in his Christian life. He was stoned in Lystra. Oh, all of his missionary travels, Paul was in constant danger of death. How about those false prophets or false apostles? You reckon they were in danger? No, they were filling their pockets.
People's ears to get you that.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have a bunch of those today who are not only making their churches rich, but they are making themselves absolutely filthy rich. Now, verse 21, instead of Gentile beating, Paul's now going to talk about Jewish beatings. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. There's that 39. Don't want to go over 40. The law said 40 was the maximum. Well, let's be safe. Let's make it 39. He says in verse 25, thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I've been in the deep. Now the rod was similar to the walking stick or to the cane-like instrument that a shepherd would have. None of these are recorded unless that rod was what was used on him in Philippi. His stoning is recorded on that first missionary journey in the city of Lystra. One of his times of being shipwrecked and having to stay in the sea for a period of time is written for our learning in the book of Acts at the island of Melita. But all these others have not been recorded. But Paul said they took place or they will take place if he was looking by inspiration into the future. What in the world have the false prophets gone through? Nothing. Nothing. You see what Paul's trying to do? And he says, in order for me to do this, I'm going to speak as a fool. I'm going to brag on myself. These false teachers, false apostles in Corinth have not gone through anything. Here's what I've gone through. Now, which one of us is the true apostle? Paul goes on speaking of his turmoil for Christ, and he does that in verse 20. What did I do? Skip one? Yeah, I did, didn't I? There's 25. Here's 26. He says, in journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. That word perils means danger. The life of one was one constantly fraught with danger. He never knew if his preaching was going to be successful or if his preaching was going to bring an end of his life. And according to this verse, this danger followed the great apostle everywhere he went and everywhere he taught the truth. In our studies of Paul, haven't we seen him run out of several towns? Whether if it be Lystra, or whether if it be Philippi or Thessalonica, or whether if it be Athens, or whether if it be Berea, or whether if it be Ephesus, all of these places he got run out of town. Paul goes on talking about his hardships in verse 27. He says, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Paul says, outside of working extremely hard for the cause of my Lord, I've had sleepless nights. I've suffered from hunger and thirst, and sometimes the clothing that I had on was not sufficient to protect me from the elements. That word weariness up there is the Greek word choros. It means to reduce the strength or intense labor. Used to work in the coal mines, and in the morning I would go in and I would be ready to go. And then after 8 hours of hard work in the coal mines, I'll tell you what, I didn't have that same strength and enthusiasm that I had had at the beginning of the shift. That's the idea of weariness. Weariness. The word painfulness, he says, that's the Greek word moxtos. It means distress. That word for watchings that's up here, sleeplessness is what that word means. Paul says, I've gone through all of these things. What have those false apostles in Corinth gone through? After listing all the things he's already mentioned, our beloved Paul goes on in verse 28 and says, beside those things which are without. Now, everything he's talked about up to this point have been things that have been put on him by those who are not members of the church. They might have been Jews, but they were not Christians. They might have been Gentiles, but they were not Christians. Now, Paul says, besides what I've had to endure from those who are not Christians, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Yep. What Paul's spoken of up to this time were things brought upon him by external things. Paul adds those things now which have been brought upon him from within the church itself. If you have a job and you care for that job, or if you have children and you care for those children, there's a mental and emotional commitment involved. Which is worse? Problems on the job or problems in the family? Problems in the family. Problems in the family. Paul's looking at the church as his family. He says, all these problems have been thrown on me from those who are not Christians, members of my family, Christian family, spiritual family. But besides what they're doing, I've got problems from my family. Problems from my church, Christian family. Paul was made to worry by those that he had birthed into Christ. But Jesus had said, don't worry. Remember in Matthew 6:31, the Lord in the Sermon on the Mount said, take no thought what you shall eat or what you shall wear. The word thought that Jesus used there means to be anxious, or as we would say, worry. Jesus says, don't worry. Don't worry. Why do you say don't worry? He said, because I'll take care of you. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness and all these things. What things, Jesus? Food and clothing and physical needs. All of these things, Jesus says, I'll take care of them for you. But you know, Paul was, and we all should be, concerned about the church and the future of the church. Even here in Betsy Lane, we need to be concerned about the future of the congregation here. We know that the church as a whole, the worldwide church, will last forever. But let's face it, congregations rise and congregations fall. And Paul was concerned with the congregations that he had started. He says, I am anxious, I worry about the congregations of the Lord's church that have been established because of me. Verse 29, he says, who's weak and I'm not weak? Who's offended and I burn not? Well, the Christians at Corinth were showing weakness. They had begun to listen to and heed the words of false apostles, teaching things contrary to what their own father in the faith, Paul, had taught them. And it was an emotional strain on Paul to see his children in faith going backwards instead of getting better. The word offended up there is the Greek word skandalizo. Sounds like scandal, scandalize, or scandalized. It means to entice to sin, tempted and being led astray. Paul says, whenever you are tempted to do wrong, whenever you're tempted to be led astray, I am inflamed with anger. I am hurt. And certainly we don't rejoice when a child of God is falling away. We too need to be concerned. What do you go glory about, Paul? Verse 30. If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities. The New American Standard Bible translates this verse this way. If I have to boast, I'm going to boast about what pertains to my weakness. Paul says, I'm going to boast of the humiliation that I've undergone for the cause of Christ. God's people have always been at their best when in their weakness they turn to God for help. The strength of God is made perfect in the weakness of man. And we'll look at that in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. The next verse. At the bottom, verse 31. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forever, knoweth that I lie not. Paul just said, the greatest thing, the greatest honor that one can have is to be weak for the Lord. Because the Lord's strength will carry me and them through. And then he says, God knows I'm telling the truth. Let me give you an example of how my weakness was shown. And this is our final verse for the night. 2 verses. We talked about Paul being let down the wall in a basket. He tells about that. He says, in Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison. There was a garrison of soldiers who stayed in Damascus. They were desirous to apprehend me, and through a window in a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hands. Listen, when Paul was known as Saul of Tarsus and he was on his way to Damascus to arrest Christians, was he a powerful man? Was he a respected man? Was he a feared man? All of those things. Yeah. He had a letter from the high priest in Jerusalem, and he had Roman soldiers with him, that if they found any who were Christians, he would have them arrested. But even though Saul had been such a powerful man, after becoming a child of God, for fear of his own life, he had to be let down in a basket from the wall of the city so he could escape harm. Listen, in his weakness, God had made him strong. When Paul was weak, with God with him, there came his strength. All right. Next time we're going to be looking into the chapter that talks about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Lord willing. Lesson is yours.